Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with the webinar. So, to start with, my name is Ben. For those of you who have not taken any of my courses before, I have been teaching online classes since about 2015, and I've worked in the digital advertising industry for over a decade. What I'm going to go over today is an excerpt from one of my courses, Introduction to Programmatic Advertising. If you are looking for additional content on digital advertising, digital marketing, highly recommend you check out our site, AdCoach.co. So let's get into it. What are we going to talk about tonight? So we're going to review the programmatic advertising space. And to do that, we need to start with an introduction. We need to define ad sizes and standards, common pricing models, set a baseline to make sure we understand what we're actually talking about when we talk about programmatic advertising. Then we're going to talk about how it works and all the companies involved, the process, how we can use data to inform our buys, talk about what programmatic is versus RTB, and finally wrap up with some auction types and a final recap. So let's get into it. Introduction to digital advertising. So first off, when we're talking about digital advertising, we're talking about any paid advertising placement running on a digital platform that includes desktop, laptop computers, mobile phones, tablets, smart TVs, over-the-top, consoles, or IoT, which is Internet of Things, any sort of device which accepts advertising. So you have your Google AdWords, your Facebook, your Yahoo search, your YouTube, your social ads on Twitter. Any one of these count as digital advertising, and pretty much all of them use some form of programmatic process to manage their ad campaigns and manage the delivery of those ads. But we are not talking about press. We're not talking about when somebody shares an article or a news and it happens to show up on your timeline as a news story. We're talking about a paid placement. Within that, when we talk about a paid placement, there are some standard ad sizes, which is definitely important when we talk about programmatic. And these ad sizes are set by or were set by the IAB in order to provide a bit of uniformity across the digital advertising space, so that if an advertiser creates one ad unit, they can run it on multiple sites, not just one, not have to create a custom ad size for every publisher that they're running on. So using an example of CNN.com, which we have here on the right, we can look through and identify a couple of ad units. Starting with this box unit, this would be a 300 by 250. We see a unit underneath it, a smaller unit. That particular unit may be custom to CNN, but we can also see it's also promoting a CNN unit. And then underneath it, we have a 728 by 90, another 300 by 250 at the bottom of the page. These are the ads that are most often used in the programmatic process. Finally, at the bottom, you see some paid content. That is native content. That is also handled via programmatic process in many situations, and it is designed to look and feel like the website itself. So an advertiser gives a title, a description, and a link, and then each website takes that and makes it look like their own news article, so it blends seamlessly into a website. Now it's important to talk about some common pricing models. So in the digital advertising world, the most common pricing model is a CPM, or cost per 1,000 ad units. And it is CPM instead of CPT because M is Latin for 1,000. This is the formula here. Also, we have the effective eCPM, and that can be what you actually paid after you've run your campaign and is served. There could be a difference between what you agreed to pay upfront and the effective CPM, because in the digital advertising world, there is opportunity for slight over or under delivery. So if I contract a website to serve 10 million impressions, they may serve 10.5 million impressions because there was more traffic than they expected. So I can calculate at the end what was the effective CPM that I actually paid. And then the other two that are common are cost per click and cost per action. Pretty simple here. How much did you pay for every click that you got? Or an action, how much did you pay for every action you got? Action could be clicking on a unit, or it could be downloading something, engaging with the website, making a purchase, taking any sort of action after you initially click on the ad unit. So getting into the programmatic process, now that we have that set as our baseline, let's talk about how it works. And the first thing to talk about is the companies involved. So first one here is an SSP, a supply-side platform. Supply-side platform is an ad tech company that works directly with publishers. And a publisher would be an app or a website. Anyone with an online presence who creates content could also be a game. Games would count as a publisher. What an SSP will do is work with hundreds or thousands of these individual publishers, apps, websites, what have you, and offer them the ability to put their ad inventory onto what's called the open exchange. So if we're talking about AppNexus, for example, AppNexus is an SSP, and they may work with a number of different apps. Obviously, this is an example handful, but we see things like games like Words with Friends, music apps like Pandora. You've got Shazam. There are messaging apps, a whole bunch of different types of apps in here. The differentiating factor is the quality and the number of publishers they work with. What makes AppNexus different from Samato or MoPub or InMobi or any of the other SSPs has to do with the inventory that they have. Now, on the flip side of that, we have a DSP, a demand-side platform. These are ad tech companies who work directly with advertisers and agencies. For advertisers, they provide inventory at scale and efficiencies not found with direct partnerships. Differentiating factor for DSPs are the number of partnerships that they have and the technology used to execute the buy. So in this situation, Ground Truth may be an example, and they may work directly with Nike, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Dunkin' Donuts, advertisers like that. So you have two important companies, an SSP and a DSP. One is working on the supply side, getting inventory. And when we say inventory, we mean available ad units. So an ad unit would be a banner unit on a website or on an app. And then on the other side, we have the advertisers that are looking to buy that. So now these two companies need to be able to communicate to each other, work together so that they can facilitate a transaction, that the DSPs can allow their advertisers to buy the inventory that's available on the SSP. So that's done through what's called an exchange. An exchange may be a third party. Oftentimes now an SSP will have an exchange built in that will allow the transaction across multiple DSPs. So all of these companies will meet in the middle, and these companies will tend to all work with each other. You wouldn't have a situation where you would have one SSP only plugged into one DSP or vice versa. They all want to plug into each other, with the idea being that if the trade desk up here is plugged into every single SSP, they will have the most access to inventory that they possibly can, meaning that they'll have more opportunities for their advertisers to buy ads. On the flip side, the SSP will want to be integrated with as many demand side platforms as they can, because they want as much possible inventory or much possible demand to buy their inventory. So in the exchange, what happens is, first off, the SSP will put a piece of inventory onto the exchange with a bit of information, including a price. And that price may be $1 is a $1 CPM. So in this situation, we may say one of these SSPs is working with Pandora, and they have available inventory that costs at least $1. On the demand side platform, they will go through all the different DSPs and all the different advertisers within it and identify an advertiser that's looking to buy that inventory. That advertiser will place a bid. If the bid wins, the inventory is sold. This transaction happens in milliseconds. We're talking a couple hundred milliseconds at most. billions of times a day. Now, obviously, that is a really baseline example of what happens. So let's talk about the data that's actually used in that transaction and how an advertiser would decide to buy a particular set of inventory. So first off, we got to define what advertisers are looking for. Generally, advertisers will look for age, gender, location, and the content of the publisher. They want to make sure that they're targeting the right audience. In that Nike example, Nike may say we want, if we're targeting men, if we're promoting men's shoes, we're only going to want to target men of a certain age range. And maybe if it's winter, we only want to target people who are in warmer climates. And then for the content side of it, they want to make sure it's running in appropriate content, maybe a sports website or a news website, possibly a game, but they don't want to run on inappropriate content. If they're targeting men, they don't want to run on a mom site or a mommy blog, something that wouldn't be appropriate for the audience that they're trying to target. On the flip side, these tech companies get a bunch of different information, and they can get none, all, or any combination of the following: age, gender, location, content, as well as ad size, engagement history, bundle ID, IP address, device ID, and sometimes PII. PII is personally identifiable information. It is illegal to collect that without a user's consent, but if you ask for it and the user gives it to you, it is okay to use that as long as the user has consented to giving you that information. That information includes your actual name, your email address, phone number, or home address. Oftentimes, everything is encrypted, which means an app will say, I know this user is in this age range. I'm pretty sure they're a male. I'm pretty sure they're from this location, or I know that they're in this location right now, but that location is a lat long. It is not necessarily a home address. If they do have that information, they are required to encrypt it before sharing it with others so that no one can piece it back together and identify an individual out of that group. So with that data is collected by the apps ahead of time. So in this process, we're going to walk through what an SSP will actually see on the exchange and how they'll pass that off to an advertiser. So we have on the left an app with a 320 by 50 ad unit available on the bottom. This app will send a request to the SSP saying that there's an ad unit available to purchase. That request will look something like this, which looks like a lot of crazy data that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but we can start to break it down and pick out the important pieces of information. First, we see under banner, we see the width and the height, 320 and 50. So we know what size unit we're looking to buy, which is important because obviously we only want to buy an ad unit that is the same size that our advertiser is trying to run. We can also look down here under bundle, and we see weather bug, and we see an IAB category, which means now we know the content, we know it's weather, and we know the actual app. Then we can also see device. Here we have Apple, the carrier is AT&T. So if we're running a campaign that is targeted only to one operating system, we know which operating system we're running on. This could be important for an app download campaign. If you're running an app download campaign for an iOS app, you don't want to run it on Android and vice versa. Then we also see a user ID. Every device has a unique user ID. This can be useful for DMPs. They can collect that, save it, and start to build a profile based on that string of letters and numbers. Then if they see that again, they can target them with a specific message. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, continuing with this, additional information we may get is location, which is really important. Here we see lat long, country, zip, and city. Obviously, these are really important to know where that user is. In that previous example with Nike, if they are targeting warm weather clothes, they don't want to be doing that in a cold weather climate. Location data is the number one thing that advertisers look for. So being able to pass through location data is really valuable for the apps. So this transaction would look something like this. All that data is sent to the SSP. The SSP passes that bid request to the exchange. That bid request is subsequently sent to the DSP, and the DSP will identify an advertiser. Once they've identified an advertiser that is looking to buy that inventory based on everything that we saw, they pass a response back to the DSP. That bid response sent to the exchange, back to the SSP, and then finally to the app, where it results in displaying the ad. Again, this entire transaction takes place in milliseconds. This is the RTB programmatic process in action. So now let's talk a little bit about data and targeting and a data management platform, a DMP. We had a lot of data that we were seeing in that last app, in that last example, and that's great every time we see an ad request come through or a bid request come through. But sometimes we want to know data ahead of time, and we want to only identify and target a subset of pre-existing individuals. So if we're Nike, we may only want to target people that we already know are sports enthusiasts. We already know they fit our target audience. So we want to identify a list of maybe millions of device IDs and user IDs, and then go out in the exchange and look for them. So the only thing that they may be looking for was that ID number that we saw, a long string of letters and numbers. There are a lot of different companies that offer this as a service. Axiom, Blue Kai, and Exalate are some of them. To give you an idea of how valuable data is, Blue Kai is now owned by Oracle. Exalate is now owned by Nielsen. And Axiom recently sold IPG for $2.3 billion. IPG being an advertising holding company. Axiom at the time claimed that they had data on 2.2 billion users. So IPG paid just about $1 per user, which actually, if you think about it, is a pretty good deal for them. Now, IPG would want to use that data across all of their digital advertising campaigns. So how might that change the picture if you're using a DMP to target an individual? Well, let's look at that process again. We have the publisher on the supply side and the advertiser on the demand side. The situation, we have Nike again and Words with Friends on the supply side as our potential app. And then under the SSP and DSP section, we have a couple of examples of both those companies. So in the traditional setting that we just walked through, the Nike DSP would send a request saying, we're looking to buy gaming apps and sports apps because that is inventory and content that would align with our messaging and our product. The SSP would say, well, we happen to have a gaming app and that meets your demand. So great. We have now made a sale. When we're using a DMP, it would look a little different. The DSP would first send a request through their DMP and say, we're looking for this information. Males 18 to 34, located in California, a household income of $75,000 or more. The DMP would go through all of their millions or billions of users and say, here are users that we know already meet that particular demand. Here's a device ID, and here is the unique advertiser ID. Then they'll go onto the exchange and say, when we see that same inventory come through, that same user come through, then we're going to target them with our ad. So in this situation, the SSP will say, hey, I have new inventory available on this publisher, and here is a UAID and the lat long. If you look up the lat long in this situation, you'll see it is in California. So now we've met the requirement to be located in California, and it's a known device ID that we already know meets our target audience because it was part of our DMP, and now it is sold. Now it's going to cost Nike a little bit more because there is a cost associated with using that DMP, but if they are finding a more targeted audience, it is definitely worth it for them because it is a higher quality audience, more likely to convert. So with all that being said, what is the difference between programmatic and RTB? Well, programmatic as a whole means to automate the decision-making process of media buying by targeting specific audiences and demographics. So essentially, it is the automation of the buying and selling process. That is what the term programmatic means. RTB means real-time bidding, and it is a means by which advertising inventory is bought and sold on a per impression basis via programmatic instantaneous auction, similar to financial markets. So programmatic is the umbrella term. RTB is the actual process by which the sale takes place. Now, we've been talking about bidding. If there is bidding, obviously there has to be some sort of auction to facilitate that bid. So, what are the different auction types? Well, the first one to be aware of is first price auction. That is the programmatic buying model where if your bid wins, you pay exactly what you bid. This type of auction maximizes revenue potential for the seller. So, if I am an advertiser and I bid $5 on a piece of inventory and I win, then I pay $5 for that. But if you remember earlier, we had an example with Pandora where Pandora was only asking for $1. Yet if I bid 5, I've now bid 5 times what they were asking, which means I've overpaid. Now it's great for the seller, being the publisher in that situation, because they're going to end up with more revenue than they had asked for, but not great for the buyer, the advertiser, because they are overpaying and wasting dollars. So the other option is a second price auction, and that is a programmatic buying model where if your bid wins, you pay 1 cent above the second highest bid in the auction. That means that in that past example, if Pandora had said, I'm looking for at least $1, and we bid $5 and win, we pay $1.01. This is the standard auction type. For obvious reasons, it means that an advertiser can maximize their budget. Then it gets into how does a seller optimize their budget? And that gets a little bit more complicated because they have to go into different line items and different waterfalls and different settings to make sure that they can get the most amount of fill and the highest price for their inventory. So how do they do that? Well, the traditional setup is via a waterfall where an advertiser or a publisher will say, we're going to use an ad server and work with multiple demand partners, multiple DSPs or SSPs. And we are going to put different levels of bids at each stage of the waterfall. At the very top, we're going to put our highest price, meaning that if an advertiser bids in our number one spot in the waterfall, they're going to have to pay the highest rate possible. If no one is willing to pay that, then it moves down to the next spot, which will have a lower floor. That's what these are called, CPM floor. So on the second one, you see it is 50 cents. If still no one wants to buy there, it will go down to the third, and this could continue up to however many stages the publisher is willing to put in there, with the idea that at every rim down on the waterfall, the advertiser is required to pay less because the other people have already passed on the inventory. The other way to do this is via a header bidding solution. This is one of the newer solutions where it is actually a true auction in that all advertisers put a bid at one time, and the highest bid wins. Now, header bidding has a lot of obvious advantages for the publisher, in that if you're getting the highest bid every time, the publisher will get more revenue for their inventory. But header bidding is a different process. Not every company is set up to do so. For the sake of this webinar, I'm not going to get into the details of waterfalls versus header bidding, but on my introduction to programmatic course on AdCoach, I do go into these in more detail. And if this is of interest, I highly recommend that you view that course, because this is definitely an important part of the programmatic space and something to be very aware of if you are working in the space or interested in working in the space. So to recap, we have inventory from an app and a bid request that includes all sorts of information about that particular inventory, the size, the content, the carrier, and the user ID. Talked about using a DMP, using another data platform to inform your buy so that you end up with a more quality audience. And then we talked about different auction types. So in this 30-40 minute overview, obviously there is a lot that we discuss, and there's a lot more that we can go into detail on. If you are interested in that, I recommend you checking out AdCoach, which is my learning platform for digital advertising professionals. Now, because you took this webinar, everyone who took this webinar is eligible to receive 50% off all of the courses. Webinar 18 is the code. AdCoach.co is the website. And if you're interested, I recommend you taking them today, because by tomorrow evening, all the prices are going up as we head into 2019 and new content will be released. So take advantage of this coupon now. Use webinar 18 to save 50% off all courses, including Introduction to Programmatic Advertising, where in that course, I cover a number of the topics we covered today, but I go into more detail about them. And I also include a lot more information about the programmatic process. It is a very large and complex industry, and it is really hard to cover it in any sort of quick overview such as this. The course goes into more detail, so I would recommend checking that out if you are interested in learning more. So thank you everyone for joining. This will be saved and available for viewing later on as well.